Okay, if everybody's ready, let's make a start. To start with, let's chant Odaimoku 3 times, please. Namu Myoho Renge Kyo, Namu Myoho Renge Kyo, Namu Myoho Renge Kyo. Thank you very much. So this is the first talk of the 2 days of a seminar about anger management. So hopefully before everybody came, they thought a little bit about what anger is and how big a role it plays in your life. But I want to use this first talk to more concretely look at what exactly anger is and why we have the potential to get angry, and whether it serves any useful positive purpose or not, or whether it's purely a negative thing. Because as you know, the Buddha said we have 3 poisons in our mind: greed, ignorance, and anger. So he described anger as a poison. So the Buddha was like a doctor in a way, because he saw some condition of suffering, and then he tried to diagnose it and find a method to resolve it. So we should try and do the same thing and check whether anger is a poison all the time. So that's the purpose of this task. We have 45 minutes for this one. So what is anger? There are many different definitions. So when I was checking, I looked for Buddhist definitions of anger, but also definitions of anger from psychology and various philosophers, and there's quite a disparity between them. But what we can say simply is that anger is a strong feeling. So it's a type of emotion of annoyance, displeasure, or hostility towards something or someone, and it's not necessarily an external somebody or something. We can be angry with ourselves. Normally we are quite often angry with ourselves. And it's characterized by antagonism towards that object which you feel has deliberately done you wrong. And it's a reaction to a perceived threat to ourselves, our loved ones, our property, our self-image, or some part of our identity. So these definitions might give us a clue as to why we have the potential to become angry, the purpose it serves, especially the last one. Anger is a reaction to a perceived threat to ourselves. So in some circumstances, anger can be very useful. If you're Mr. Caveman and a saber-toothed tiger is outside knocking on your cave door and you can't get angry, you might be in a bit of trouble. Anger can be very useful in that situation. So anger is born into you. It's an innate potential, and it's part of our self-defense system for staying alive. So it's in response to a threat, for self-preservation. And what anger does, when we become angry, it gives us fuel for us to fight for our survival. Without that fuel of anger, it might be difficult to fight for your survival. I don't know. So I welcome your comments later on about this. So anger is also described as a second-hand emotion. This is a very interesting thing, because if we experience pain, we might become angry, but we don't necessarily always become angry as a result of pain or some unpleasant feeling. So first of all, we experience pain or unpleasantness, and then we need some other something, some other condition, and then when the two of them come together, then we get angry. But pain by itself is not necessarily leading to anger. So it never occurs in isolation, and it's always preceded by a pain feeling or unpleasant feeling. And as I said, it's not enough just by itself, so we need something to trigger the response of anger as a result of the pain. And anger triggering thoughts include personal assessments, assumptions, evaluations, or interpretations of situations. So broadly, we can say judgment. If we experience pain, the only reason we would respond with anger is if we deem that pain as a threat. In other words, it might happen again. So we have to respond with anger to destroy the possibility of that pain coming again. So we experience pain, and then we have to have some kind of judgment that thinks, oh, this is a threat to me, and then we respond with anger. So it never occurs in isolation. And but this isn't foolproof. If you ever, I have no hair, so it's particularly painful. If you bash your head on something low, I find myself sometimes, I hit my head and it's painful, and then I want to hit the object which just caused me pain, but of course it's just a low doorway or something, so it's no threat to me, it's not going to hurt me again. But something in my brain doesn't quite register that it's not an active threat, and there's no point hitting the door frame because it's not going to react and any respond to that. So things which can produce anger but which don't always produce anger: feeling threatened, feeling that you're being ignored or not taken seriously, being insulted or criticized, bullying, a failure, disappointment, someone going against a principle which you consider important, this kind of righteous anger, verbal or physical assault, being interrupted when pursuing a goal, or being under the influence of drugs or alcohol. So all of these are a threat to ourselves or a threat to our self-identity or something like that. So, as I mentioned though, anger is not always the most useful response, with the door frame for example. So in the brain, this is very interesting. What happens is, when we experience something with our senses, we see some danger, or we hear some danger, or some insult, or the saber-toothed tiger coming towards us. Some data gets input, and then it goes straight to this thing called the amygdala. The amygdala is what controls all of our emotions. It's what generates emotion. So first of all we get the data, and then it goes to the amygdala, and the amygdala decides based on the data, okay, I'm going to respond with anger, or I'm going to respond with fear or happiness or some other emotion. But it's not a foolproof system. So the brain is hardwired in a very useful way if we're in an actual life-threatening situation, but it doesn't always serve us well the rest of the time. Because what happens is, first of all, sensory data from your sense organs is detected, and then it goes to the thalamus. And then step 2, the data is sent to the amygdala. And then what happens is, data is passed on to the cortex. The cortex is your logical reasoning part of your brain. So you think, okay, that makes sense. But then step 4, amygdala does a quick threat assessment, and then step 5, it blocks slow thinking. So what happens is, you receive this data, and then your amygdala takes control, and it says, we're going to pass the information on to the logical part of the brain, but we're going to then block it. and respond directly from the amygdala. So what happens is, actually your logical thinking part of your brain isn't used. So that's why whenever you get angry, you do and say things which you usually later regret, because you haven't had time to properly process and think about what's going on. Your amygdala just says, okay, react, like a reflex reaction. So if you're caveman, very useful, but if somebody cut you up when you're driving to the temple, maybe not great. So all of our emotions are the domain of the amygdala, and information and data that is picked up by our senses, things that we physically feel or see or hear, is turned into an emotional response in the amygdala. So as I said, all of our logical thinking is done in a different place, the prefrontal cortex. So the problem with anger is, when we're under its influence, we can't think clearly for that reason, because we're bypassing the clear thinking part of the brain. And also, whenever we're angry, we suddenly become very bad communicators. So people always try and justify their anger. They say, oh, well, that person was doing such and such, which is wrong, and I needed to get angry to be able to educate them or tell them that it was wrong. But the problem is, when you're angry, you can't think clearly, and you communicate very badly. So normally they just hear hot air, and they just hear angry noise, rather than actually being educated by your tirade. So it's for that reason, because we bypass the thinking part of the brain. So the amygdala has a unique override function. So it's called amygdala hijacking. So I think we should try not to be, what we've got to try not to be at the mercy of our amygdala. Let it control us. So, because only when we have calm minds can we respond wisely or to any injustice or misdeed.